So you mentioned that Santokh Singh Ji is playing a drum and reciting his poetry. I'm assuming that he's done his research, reading and preparation beforehand and is then repeating what he wants written to his scribes, or is he engaging with the material and then telling his scribes what to write on the fly?
So Veer Singh writes about this and saying that it would be very difficult for somebody like Santokh Singh to just kind of make it on the fly, as you say, because he's in some portions um, he's following his source material very carefully. For example, there's a portion in Sosaki that's like 100 ardases or something like that. And so Veer Singh gives that example, like how would Santokh Singh have memorized all of those one, like, and listing them in the correct order and all this type of stuff. And it's possible, like, so Veer Singh's suggestion is that in the morning, he would probably sit down and he would probably have his source material out there and he would probably write it there. And then he would kind of memorize his portion. So each chapter of Suraj Prakash, which is what we do on the podcast, is just one chapter, is one episode, is about 40 to 60 verses. And it's largely in a chopai meter, like how we recite Kabir Baj Benti Chopai. It's like that meter. Because it's a very narrative style of meter. And you see that in the Charitras a lot as well, Dasam Granth. And so he probably either memorize that portion and then he would sit down with his lakaris and he would write his scribes and he would kind of recite that, or there was a parda there was a cloth there between him and his lakaris, so perhaps he had some books there in front of him, he was looking at it and he was like, okay, this line is like that, and then he would recite that line. But all of that is just based on what Veer Singh himself has heard from people who were there around that time. Even that part about the sukkah, he's like, people say that, but I can't prove it for sure. I mean, he's gonna say that because he doesn't want to just say like, he wants to give people an out to be like, people say it, but we don't know for sure. But he also takes other people's suggestions on other matters as for sure. So I mean, yeah, you can see his a little bit of bias there.
What language is Suraj Prakash written in, and is it similar to Sri Dasam Granth in that it utilizes more than one language?
Yeah, so Guru Gobind Singh is just a master poet. He's writing across like so many different languages. Santokh Singh is a master poet, but he's writing primarily in Braj Bhasha. He writes in Braj Bhasha, which is like a language largely used in Dasam as well. You can think about it as an old version of Hindi. It's not utilized today. It's utilized in the works of Guru Tegh Bahadur. It's utilized in Adi Guru Granth Sahib, to some extent. But Braj Bhasha is the primary language in Suraj Prakash. And then Santokh Singh is a master of Sanskrit as well. So there's a lot of Sanskrit terminology and vocab in there, which is why Veer Singh has to put significant amount of footnotes to say, okay, this word means this, to explain to readers what these words are. But so I would say Braj Bhasha and Sanskrit are the main. So Veer Singh writes that Santokh Singh is knowledgeable of Farsi and Arabic to some extent, but like he says, like Sadar, and like he knows like an average amount of that. And his vocab, Santokh Singh, when, for example, Mughals are talking to each other, he'll like use like Farsi and Arabic vocab in there as well, which is really funny and interesting. But yeah, it's primarily Braj Bhasha.
So you'd mentioned that when Kavi Santokh Singhs takes his work to Akal Takht, it's very quickly accepted across the land by the Sangat, but also endorsed by Gyanis and teachers. Could you expand a little on its history and how it's received from that point onwards?
Yeah, so in 1880, like, about 40 years after Santokh Singh writes, this text is widely accepted throughout the community as like kind of the gold standard, that this is what people should be engaging with. About 40 years after that, when Veer Singh begins this plan to publish the text, which takes him close to 10 years, even at that point, he says in his introduction that people at that point, and he mentions this because of the Singh Sabha Lehar, because of this movement of the Singh Sabha, that people were telling him, hey, maybe we should remove certain parts of Suraj Prakash. And this is something I wanted to clarify as well. You very generously were praising the podcast on Net Nahang's episode. And you mentioned I had said something like Veer Singh edited the text. Veer Singh did not edit the text insofar as anybody knows currently. That has yet to be seen. What Veer Singh does is, so in his introduction, he says, okay, people are telling me there's portions in Suraj Prakash that we should take out. And he says, he gives this whole argument of we shouldn't take anything out. This is against the process of publication. Nobody in the realm of publication or history writing would deem that acceptable, which is interesting because we do know he edits Panprakash. Like he takes certain words out and he cuts portions out. So we'll leave that aside for now. So Veer Singh puts that argument saying we can't do that. But what we can do is we can put commentary, we can put footnotes, we can contextualize, we can explain why the poet Santokh Singh may have written what he did. I have theories on this as well that, by that time, Suraj Prakash is so widely established. If he were to come out with his own version, and there were published like printed versions of Suraj Prakash, they were Ladivar though at that, and they're stone print or lithograph print. So that was already out there. If Veer Singh came out and he started editing portions like that and cutting portions out, perhaps it wouldn't have sold as it did. Veer Singh did have a publication house, so he was making money off of these things. So he would have to make sure that, so he had that angle as well. So he says, okay, we shouldn't edit it. It's against the process. So he puts footnotes in it, and he kind of spreads out the words so that, people who are less trained can engage with the text and still enjoy it. So and that's about the 1920s when he's writing this. It takes him about 10 years. This is the longest thing he's ever worked on. Veer Singh did a Kosh, a dictionary for Guru Granth Sahib, that took him about 7 years. He spent more than 10 years, about 10 years on Suraj Prakash publication, which just shows you how, and he's like enamored by Kavi Santokh Singh. If you read closely his introduction and throughout the text, he's in awe of the construction of Santokh Singh, of how he's building this text out. Even though there's portions of the text, like portions that relate to the Devi, Chandi, etc., which he, thinks is a product of its time. So he says that, that can't be. And so from that Veer Singh publication, which he came out in 14 volumes, that's basically how people have engaged with this text, Suraj Prakash, until now. I mean, very recently, in the past 10, 20 years, there's been a commentary written in Punjabi by Dr. Olak. That commentary I use in my work, but it is loose at times in terms of translation, so I take it with a grain of salt. I use it to help me in some respects, but I also have to listen to Gatha. So another way people engage with this text is through learning institutions like Nahangs, Taksals, Udasis, Nirmale and stuff, who have been teaching this text for centuries, for over a century essentially. And that's where you will hear katha of it. If you go online, there's people that have recorded the entire Suraj Prakash in terms of katha, which would take years to do, and it would take years to listen to as well. So what we're doing now for the first time ever is providing this text in English, which this has never been done, and which is interesting because the majority of history that we have is largely taken from Suraj Prakash. So when McAuliffe is writing his, history lyrics in English, when he asks for source material, the Panth at that time suggests to him that you should read Suraj Prakash. And he does take from Suraj Prakash, but there's elements of it that he's like, oh, it's Indic mythology, Hindu mythology, I'm going to throw that aside. He doesn't know how to utilize that, and he doesn't know how to contextualize that in the context of storytelling. So, he uses from it, discards it. And from those type of English works, we have what we have today in terms of a really kind of watered down, really black and white, really dull and dry type of history. Like there's no flavor in it, there's no essence in it, and which is why I find really interesting the kind of feedback from the podcast is people are always like, oh, you have a way of like contextualizing or humanizing the guru, which I found out first really interesting because there are significant portions of karamat, like miracle components in it as well, right? Which is not unusual. We find that in Guru Granth Sahib, we find that in Dasam Granth Sahib, we find that in Bhai Gurdas Vara, we find it in Bhai Mani Singh's works. So it's not like Santokh Singh making it up. He's following in a tradition. We have to just understand what that means, right? So you have to think about storytelling, etc. But there's miracle components, but yet it's humanizing because they talk about emotion. They show events through emotion and in a way to convey emotion, right? And that's something that we should all really think deeply upon, is how storytelling relates to emotion, how katha has to relate to emotion to be effective, right? And that's why I think Santokh Singh's writings have lasted the test of time, because they just immerse you with, like, portions of it are tragic, like Bandar Khan passing away. Guru Hargobind's basically, adopted orphan. Like Bandar Khan was an orphan who the Guru adopts, he builds up, he gets him married, he gives him money, he trains him up martially, all this type of stuff. And then he has to fight him, unfortunately, right? And then he has to kill him. And then you get through that. And then you go through other stories. Guru Gobind Singh's, who's so like Bir Rasi and so kind of inspiring. Bachitra Singh's kind of battle against the Hathi, the elephant. These like pump everybody up. And it's interesting because another thing that Veer Singh notes is like, Santokh Singh is not just a poet. Like Santokh Singh, he knows what he's talking about when it comes to military and martial, ability, which is really fascinating. Like he's not like some Udasi Nirmal Assad sitting there in the corner. Like even if you look at the painting of Santokh Singh, like he's holding a katar in his right hand, like a punch dagger. He's not holding a kalam, like a pen. Like this guy is a Jangi Singh, right? Which I found like really interesting, and like how detailed the description sometimes in the battles of the duels of the gurus. I'm like, oh, like he actually knows how this would work, like where the arm would go if you're, for example, blocking a shield in this way and moving about that way. And it's just like the devil's in the details. Like it's just really makes a massive difference, and it hits the audience different as well if you're including those details and if you're engaging with emotion in that way.
I feel like Kavi Santokh Singh's work is one, if not the last, in the lineage of pre-colonial literature that humanizes the Sikh gurus and reflects the work of Arvind Mandir in Religion and Spectre of the Sikhs, in that there is a change in the construction of logic where we view mysticism and now kind of see that in the trappings of religion. Feel free to add your comments to that.
Well, about that, the first thing that comes to mind to me is just related to ideas about identity. And that's a big problem for some when they engage with Suraj Prakash, is that, like, I would suggest to everybody who's listening, if they can, wrestle and kind of, really cut your teeth on Mandir's works. Mandir's works are fantastic. They're very complicated and they're worth like, wrestling with for many months and years perhaps. But Santokh Singh is writing before that specter of religion enters that, mindset in Punjab, right? So he's writing in a way that's different to how we understand religion and identity now. And that's something that I have received comments on, like, why are the weddings, performed in a certain manner? Like Babak Rababi gets buried, he's a Rababi at the Pant, like why would he not be cremated? All these type of issues I think can be cleared up in knowing how people, thought about identity differently, but also about relating to divinity, right? Like how people are thinking about divinity. I think a lot of that, this is really good work out now by Julie Vidge, professor at York University, who's writing on Gurbalas, of how Sikh historiography, how Sikh history was written in a way which utilized Vaishnava concepts of thought. And that's one way to think about how the Gurbalas literature is using even notions about Devi and Chandi. They're using it in a manner not to substantiate those ideas, en masse, like all of what they say, but they're utilizing that to convey certain ideas about royalty, about kingship, about divinity as well. So I would urge everybody to look. She has a book coming up, so just wait for that, and we can I would suggest for you to have her on as well. I think she would be a great guest.
As you were talking, I quickly made note of her email, so thank you. I would certainly get in touch with her. There was one thing you mentioned, though, that I wanted to ask you, that was in terms of kind of translations and commentaries that have been published since. How do you think they deviate from the original or reflect the understandings of the writers and kind of their respective schools of thought?
So in relation to commentaries and kind of how Katha is done, and perhaps dissertation, like distortions from the Katha and from the stories itself, it's interesting because for those who want to engage with Suraj Prakash through like commentary, Tika, they have Oluk's version of it. And Oluk at times, for example, he'll either make a note underneath a line saying, classic missionary, like Hoi nahi sakta, like this is not possible. Or like he'll do something even subtle, where it's like, I've seen instances of this where it's like, let's say it's about sukheli dig or something like cannabis, and it'll say like, oh, Guru Samne, the Guru just drank water, like he'll like convert sukha into water, and he's like, he had a glass of water, and that water made him really happy, and it doesn't make it must have been really good water. So you have stuff like that, or you have portions I've seen online, people who do katha perhaps on the wedding, prasangs, the stories about the weddings, where it'll say like the line will say something akin to, the guru or whoever is getting married walked around the fire, and then it'll say like, they did lama and then they read Anand Sahib and stuff. Like they'll just start they'll add to it and say these lines, right? And I guess they reflect notions about identity, which they think that, if the gurus performed these, rites, let's say weddings around a fire and what have you, that those would be deemed, quote unquote Hindu, which, I guess that's a long discussion as well, like what is Hindu. But I think I've been lucky, and there's people online that do this. Like I've been lucky to learn under Santikani Indrajit Singh, and he holds to the text, very strongly, and like he doesn't deviate from the meaning of the text. He always kind of stresses like, listen, if we don't understand the text, that's not the text's fault, that's our fault. Like we should do everything we can to contextualize, okay, why was it written that way? Like how can we understand it, rather than always being like, oh, this doesn't, see fit according to me, impossible, this is not right, which is a very humble approach to have. And I really want to stress that approach to people who are going to listen to the podcast, or are going to engage with anything pre-colonial. It's like, listen, this was written in a different time, let's try to understand why it was written in that way. And it's fair to have those questions. Like those questions actually are brought up in Sikhani Bhagatmala as well. At the end of Sikhani Bhagatmala, Singhs asked by Mani Singh, hey, the gurus had their weddings as you described around fire, the Brahmins there, etc. And just as a side note here, in these texts, when it mentions this, like Suraj Prakash, it always says, this is kul dirit. This is the tradition of the family. This is familial traditions. So it's like disassociating from a religious kind of tradition as well. It's saying, oh, the families, they've done this for some time. They're just doing that. Like, it's not really important in the sense of like, okay, now all of a sudden we are, quote unquote Hindu, which, those also definitions are very difficult to pin down pre-colonial. So Singh's asked by Mani Singh about this question, and it's actually really interesting. At the end of Sikhani Bhagatmala, this question comes up, and Bhai Mani Singh himself gets Guru Gobind Singh's daskat, his handwritten signature on this hukam, basically, to say that, listen, we in the past, the gurus have done, we've called Brahmins and what have you, but now we should read Anand Sahib for weddings. And then it says, after that, call the Brahmins and do whatever. Like if it's essentially, I read that as, if it's your familial tradition, go ahead, do it. It doesn't like, but read Anand Sahib now. Like this is now going forward, this is going to be a tradition. So those type of traditions evolved over time, surely. And, nobody is going to read these type of texts and say, oh, we should go back to like doing all, like these traditions evolve over time. And the Khalsa Panth has mandate to, I guess, change traditions essentially as well, like to mandate, okay, we're going to do this now. The Guru has given authority in some sense, right, to the Khalsa Panth to make these type of decisions. But yeah, so, I mean, largely the distortions in terms of the meanings come from those elements where at the core of it, it deals with identity. Like, for example, even at the Devi Prasang and the stories about Chandi, a lot of the times for people who are engaging with Suraj Prakash in a Gurdwara, they'll have somebody doing katha of it. I've seen this in Surrey. When these type of stories come up, the kathavachiks just like kind of flip the pages and like hope nobody notices. And they're like, oh, yeah. So that happens. The flipping the pages happens a lot, and which has given ammunition to the missionary side, where they say like, listen, the Taxalis and the rest of the lot who don't even actually believe in the text. Like they're actually giving ammunition to those people, which I think is the wrong move. I think the move should be, you contextualize it, you explain it as best as you can, and if you can't, well then there's a learning opportunity for you.